multiple ways in which to call a function for execution. And for those who don't know, a function is basically a container that's holding whatever you want it to do, whether you're rendering something out to the screen, doing a bit of work on some sort of parameter that you're sending in, whatever that may be. And you'll see that as we go through some of this code here. So what I'm going to do first is start with just some basic PHP with a demo site launched and spun up. And then we'll take a look at it in the context of WordPress. But I want to get the basics down before that we get into WordPress itself and how this can be used. Alrighty. So let's say we have a normal function, and this is a named function, and we're going to pass a variable into it, and basically what we're going to do is square this. And you're seeing this, if you've done any WordPress work, you may not have seen squared, but you've seen other functions within the system, within your plugins, within your themes, or if you're looking at core, you're going to see functions throughout. And the way you call it, if I can spell. And what would you expect this to output? Pretty simple, right? Should output 4. So let's take a look and see what this thing outputs. And we do get 4. Another way that we can call a function is actually to use an anonymous function, and specifically this one will be create_function. Let me show you what that looks like. All right, the first argument that you're sending into this are the variable or variables that you're going to be sending into this dynamically created function that you're defining now. The second part is the actual work that the function itself is doing. And the way you call it, we'll talk about this here in just a second, so just bear with me as I get the code onto the page. The way that you call this, first you'll notice that it is assigned to a variable. Then that variable, what I'm doing is calling that as though I'm calling the function. So let me take a look. If we come up, back up here to square, in the first example that I gave you, the named function, you'll see that you execute it by calling square, putting the parentheses around, and then passing whatever number that you want sent into that function to be evaluated. Same thing is occurring here with the anonymous function, or the lambda create function. Again, what you're doing is there is a number that then is passed into this dynamically created task or work that this function is going to be doing. And here you can see it's the exact same as square above. And the way that you do this is then it is assigned to a variable, and then somewhere within your code you would then call that particular variable to execute the dynamically created function. In this case, we're just going to do it right after this, just for demonstration purposes. You can see I passed a 3 into it, and we would expect this to output a 9. And you say, wow, show me. Put in my semicolon, just as I would up here. It's got to have the exact same syntax to be valid. And let's come back here, and we get a 9. Nothing earth-shattering so far. Let me tell you right off the bat that create_function, I've got it pulled up here within the PHP manual documentation. You'll see that that is code that you can use with the version of PHP 4 and greater. You'll see that in a couple of places. I think there's like 3 places currently within the WordPress core where they are dynamically creating an anonymous function. And you can do a global search and be able to find those. But it allows WordPress then to be compatible back before 5.3 came out. Now, as of 5.3, we got something even greater that we could work with. To me, if you look at create_function, it's not intuitive as you're looking at this code, and mostly if you're going to do quite a few things within the dynamic function itself, the code, this particular string that you're creating can be quite cumbersome, difficult to read, even a bit verbose, if you will. So let's take a look at what 5.3 gave us. And for expediency's sake, what I'm going to do is just copy and paste this, and you don't need to see me sit and type. This is a closure. Let's look at the difference between the Lambda that we had above, or the Lambda style anonymous function we had above, and now this closure. Here we used a particular keyword, create_function, and defined it as we went through above. With the closure itself, what you're doing is actually laying out the structure of the function the same way that you did in the very first example, the same way that you're accustomed to and you see throughout the WordPress core, within your themes, within your plugins, and so on. The only thing that's different, well, there's a couple of things that are different. One is there's no name, right? You'll see square up above. It says function square. The closure is anonymous. There's no name attached to it. Rather, what you're doing is assigning it to a variable. And you do need to assign it to a variable. Then you'll execute that particular variable somewhere else in your code, just like you would have up above with the square itself. There's some reasons why you can do this versus just laying out a particular the square, the named function itself. You may be looking at this and going, oh, why would I ever want to do that? And we'll go through some examples later on with some real live WordPress code so you can see real world examples. One of the biggest that I like, well, there's 2. One is that so I don't have to have quite as much code when I'm doing some very small, minimal task within the hooks. Say I want to do something to the page title. I want to add a class to the post. I want to add a class to the body itself. Those types of things. Very simple. The second one is that I want to inject a closure into another function or method. And you'll find with me that I work with objects and classes, so therefore it's usually going to be a method if you're looking at my code. But let's go ahead and walk through this. You'll see the code looks exactly the same as the named function above. However, there's no name attached to it. Instead, you're assigning it to a variable. Don't freak out about that. If you work with JavaScript or jQuery, you're used to seeing that, right? You'll have an element that you've gone out and searched for in the DOM, and then you're having a click function attached to it. You put a comma on there, and what's next? Function. You're closing that off. That's a closure. Same thing in PHP. You're basically defining a dynamic function that you'll be calling later on down the line. Alrighty. So here, if I pass 4 into this, I would expect to get a 16, right? And I get a 16. Okay. Very basic. And I know I threw it at you, though, pretty quick. So let's look at some other things that we can do. Here is another way that you may want to do it is you're dealing with an object instead of just with procedural functions, maybe you want to deal with a class structure and the methods, okay? So in that case, the way that you would call this one is, let's say we would call square, we're going to instantiate this particular class. Now I have an object, square. I'm just going to bar dump this out to the screen. And I'm going to say square, and I'm going to call the solve on it, and then I'm going to pass something. We'll just build 4 in. And if I spell things properly, which I don't, then things will work jolly good. All right. So what's happening here is I have a class set up. This is extremely basic, by the way, but I have a class called square. I have a method called solve. You pass in the number, and the two numbers are then multiplied to each other. The number is multiplied to each other to give you a square. The same as you saw before if we flip back here. But now we're doing it within an object itself, within a class. So we instantiate the class, we get ourselves an object. We then take that object and we call the method on it to solve for, and our expected output is $16. Look at that. Hey, hey, hey. Cool. That's one way of doing it. Let's take a look at this. I have a math class set up, but we don't use this in production. This is just for demonstration purposes. But let's say this is a simple calculator, for example. Let's just call it calculator. And we're going to skip the solve for a second, but down here we have some functions. You'll have an add, a square, a multiply, and you would just keep going on down the list, right? Well, what if we could also have a generic solve function where you pass in what the expression should be, you pass some args to it, we check if it's callable, and then we go ahead and call that particular expression and pass the args to it. That way it's completely defined at runtime or somewhere else within the code or plugin or whatever else is going to be using it. Okay, so first we need to define an expression. And one thing I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go ahead and add a quick message on the screen to show us that this is getting called, and I'm just putting fired. We'll just echo that out. We're going to stick with the exact same boring example over and over again of squaring. So we've just defined a anonymous closure, which is doing the squaring again, and we're assigning that into expression. Okay. And I'm going to have an object called calculator, and I'll do a new calculator. All right, so I've instantiated my calculator class, and now I have an object. I'm just going to bar dump this out. And I'm going to call the solve method on my object. I'm going to pass in my expression that I defined above, and I'm going to give it some args, which in this case will just be one number. And we would expect that to output 25, right? Now, notice the very first line, fired. It did go and fire the closure that we defined, that anonymous function, and then it squared it and gave us a 25. So let's go back and look at that. It's not black magic. It's some pretty cool stuff, though. We'll come down here and we're going to look at our anonymous function. It looks just the same as we had previously and back here in these examples that I gave right here. The only thing that's different is this one's just assigned to the variable func, and this one's assigned to the variable expression. And then I put the fired in there so that we would know that that thing really did fire. Then we instantiated the calculator class and stored it in the variable. So now I have a calculator object. I then call the solve method on that object. I then call the solve method on this object. I then pass in the expression, which is that closure that we just defined up above. And I'm passing it the number that I want to be evaluated within that particular anonymous function. Now, let's follow the tree here as we go along. Okay, my object. Here's my object. Here's my solve. I am injecting and I am type hinting that this needs to be a closure. And I'm injecting that expression right into my particular method. I'm also passing the args. Now we could say number, but in this case, because it is dynamically defined, we could have more than one argument. We could have an array of arguments that are being passed. It could be an integer, it could be a float. We don't know what that's going to be, so therefore it just needs to sit there as args. Then I'm going to make sure that this closure is callable. I'm then going to return. I'm going to go ahead and execute that particular expression by calling it, passing the args into it, and then return it back to the caller itself, which in this case, here's the caller, which is this object. Now, if this doesn't make a lot of sense to you, what I want you to do is take the code that's going to be supplied. You'll see a link there in the lesson. Take the code and play with it little by little. Just break it down. Read the documentation that I told you about. Sit and play with this to see if you start to understand some of these concepts. Some of the things that you may or may not understand, for example, are namespace. You may be looking at that going, why in the heck is she doing that? I mean, real quick, I'll give you this, but we'll be talking about it more and more as we go into object-oriented programming and the methodology and how I like to code things. You have to make sure that any of your functions, variables, objects, anything else, all your classes all have their own name. Any duplicate names are then going to, if they're a function or a class, it's going to toss an error. And so therefore what you want to do, let's say I didn't have this namespace up here. What would happen then in this case is if someone else, another plugin, somewhere in the core, whatever, had calculator as a class, it's going to toss an error because PHP is going to come down and take a look and go, they're named the exact same thing. I don't know what to do with this. The way that you get around that, there's two ways. One is to say, prefix it with your own, whatever you want it to be. I could call that Tanya if I wanted. The other way to do it is with namespaces, and this is how I prefer to prefix any of my code. It makes it more modular, and actually as you start to see some of the plugins that I'll be pumping out, I actually will then go and namespace it in a modular sort of format. So this might be math, or it may be calculator. But we'll go into that in more detail later. But you can keep adding on as you go down the pike, and that's really a good way of naming things. The other thing is type hinting. Before I get to that, this use up here may throw some folks for a loop. Because I'm in a different namespace, closure doesn't mean anything to the to PHP itself. So if I went like this and tried to run it, you'll see nothing pops up on the screen because I'm actually tossing an error, and that's being stored off in my server files. Okay, so let's put that back in. So if I take a look, what's happening then is I'm defining what namespace that's under as well as the class it gets defined. The other way I could have done it, since it's not namespaced itself, was to go like this. That would be another way to do it so that it knows it's at the root to namespace along the way. But let's say something had multiple. Let's say, for example, when you see Fulcrum coming out, it had multiple namespaces to it. You can see that's how I would call it, and then I can use ILC container throughout the system. Okay, so let's get rid of that. Type hinting. Let's say I knew that this was always going to be an array. I can type hint that. That way it's right there. I know exactly what that's going to be with that variable that's coming into this particular method. I know what that's going to be. It's defined for me. Type hinting helps in so many different ways. One, right here it helps, but also the way that you really should be coding objects is to code them to an interface and then bind whatever instance of that interface to a particular class itself. Again, future videos that we'll go through, but then that would allow me to inject. Let's say that IOC container, I would have a contract, I can inject that in. Let's say I want to swap out that binding. I could do that easily within the code, but nothing gets touched here in this particular calculator. That might have flown all over your head. If it did, don't worry about it. I just wanted to give a real quick explanation as some of these things here, as you may be looking at it going, what's that? All right. Anything that you look at that you're not sure, like, is callable. It's a PHP keyword. You can easily, and I always recommend, you're either going to spend a lot of time in the PHP docs and or in the WordPress codex. That's where you should be spending a lot of your time. You need to learn the code and learn the code the right way, and the way to do that is to look at the core code itself, if it's available, and to read the docs. That's where you find your answers as to how this code is actually functioning. And from there, you're able to then be able to become a better programmer and pull out the right tools out of the toolbox to get the job done. All right, so we've gone through this. Let's put it into the context of WordPress. Get rid of that. Get rid of this. Pull this up. All right. I have a simple little class for a plugin. And let's go and take a look at the demo that I've spun up here. This is a Genesis theme. There's nothing special about it. The only thing in the back end that's different is that I have my plugin activated. That's it. Otherwise, out of the box, this is just a, you can see it has a hello world here. There's nothing else that I've done to it. All right, I want to give you some real world examples of how you can use closures. So what we're going to do is walk down through this. Bear with me, step by step. Alrighty, if you were to look in the where the underscore title is being used in the WordPress core, you can do a search real quick. The title. Apply filters. Give it a second. And a second is up. And what you'll come to find, let me just pull this up so you can see. It's used in multiple places throughout. For us, the one that we're interested in here is this one and this one in our post template. It's also used in commenting and the general template and so on. Regardless, all of them have the same structure. You are passing the title that is going to then be sent back through that particular filter and then rendered out onto the screen, and also the ID, post ID. All right. You can see in WordPress or in your themes or your plugins, there's two ways of being able to attach yourself to a filter. Sorry about that. If you're working in a procedural function method, that means you're not within a class structure. What you would do is have the hook, the particular hook that we're going to be attaching ourselves to, along with your callback. What priority, and then the number of args that are going to be passed. Okay. If you're not sure of how this works, I invite you right now to head on out to WordPress Core or WordPress Codex, and you can pull it up, and here you will see that you're attaching a function which is a callback, and you can see right here it says callback, that's being attached to this particular hook. And when that hook is called, that callback then, that's going to go through all the callbacks that are attached to it and execute those. And of course we'll have another video that just talks about hooks and goes through that code and how that works. I knew someone was thinking that right off the top of their head. Okay, so that's how you do it if you're not working within a class structure. I'm in a class, so therefore I need to do it this way. I can't call just the callback directly because I'm in a class. I need to be able to say what instance of this particular class there is. So I use the this, and then here is the class or the method that is going to be called. And that's right here. All right, so what I'm going to do is demonstrate that yes, this works. And I'm doing that by putting a prefix on there that I'm using a callback, and you'll see it show up on the page. Very simple. Hey, look at that. So using a callback dash hello world, that works. Excellent. What if, for grins and giggles, I'm grinning and giggling, how about you? What if I wanted to use a closure? Why not? Why do I have to call a specific callback and have a method take up space within my class? Mostly since all that I'm doing here is a handful of little lines. There's really no reason that I would have to, per se, have a method unless I wanted that particular method just for documentation purposes, reading, easeability, those types of things. If it's something that I expect people to be going in and editing, I might do that. In this particular case, though, we've seen these closures before. They're very simplistic. Basically, you define the exact same thing as here. So it's got the title, it's passing in the post ID, and all I'm doing is adding a prefix instead of callback. Now it says I'm using the closure. One thing you want to note when you do this is look at the structure up here again. Let me just pull this back up. Look at the structure. This is the callback, right? The array, and then I have the priority level, and then I have how many args. In this case, there are 2. You need to follow that exact same structure when you're using the closure. So here, I have 10, priority of 10, which is the default, and I'm passing in 2 args. Here's 2, 1, 2. All right. Let's execute this. There we go, using a closure. That's one simple example, real world example. Although it's not really real world, is it? Because you would never go and say I'm using a closure and putting it in front. However, you might be putting something like, oh goodness, I don't know, a dash icon in front of it or something else. Maybe you want some sort of, oh gosh, I don't know, something else that you want to put in front of it. Well, here's another example. Let me turn this one on. Hold on one sec. And we'll come on down. All right, lesson 3. What we're going to do in this case is I'm going to add a formatter in front of this. What I'm going to do is wrap the title itself in a color just so that we can see the color on the page changes. That's all we're going to do. Okay, so in this case it's exactly the same, but what's going to happen here is this is going to toss an error and it's not going to show up on the screen. The error will show up on the screen, but this wrapping will not. It will not render correctly, and I'll explain to you why in 1 second. Maybe if you're into this, you might have figured it out already. I'm sure a couple of you already have. Oh no, we have an error. Undefined variable formatter. Undefined variable formatter. You can see there's little squigglies here that PHP Storm is telling me because it doesn't know what this variable is. It is not defined within the scope of this function. You can see I'm passing in title. I'm passing in the post ID, which I'm not using, but I'm not defining formatter anywhere. So it doesn't know what to do with that. If I instantiated it, if I put a declaration onto it, and I went like that, you can see that error went away, but so did everything else because I'm not wrapping it with anything. There's nothing for this to be able to construct and send back. So one way that you could do this is to say that you want to set up a global, and please goodness don't do globals. But it's one way that you could do it. Now what's happened is, and let me walk you through and explain why. Well, first let me show you that it works. Wow, it's magic. Okay. I told you that the closure itself did not know about this particular variable. It was not defined within the scope of that function itself. Look at the parent method that's wrapped around it, that's calling it. Take a look at that up here. Before we had formatter, it was defined there. However, that's within the scope of the parent. It was not being passed into the scope of the closure. Therefore, the closure couldn't act upon it. They're isolated. They don't know how to talk to one another unless you're passing the particular variables and args into the function to be executed. By doing it as a global and then defining it as a global down here, we've now made it known to the function that this is a global variable, and because it's global, it's accessible and can be changed by anything in the website itself. Anything, which is why I'm not a fan of globals. Well, that they take up memory too, but I'm just not a fan of globals. Let's get rid of that. We're going to show you another way of doing it, and the proper way to pass parent variables into the closure itself. Okay, you want to use the keyword use. You see it right here. See that? Wrap the variable or variables from the parent and then send them into the function. That's what's going to be happening here. So now it is defined. See, I don't have any squigglies that are going on. Let's go ahead and run this. And by the sheer magic of TV, it works. Cool. All right, let's go to the documentation of an anonymous function. And we're going to come down here and you can see use. Well, here's the documentation for that. Hold on one second while I adjust my eyes to find it. Here we go. So closures may not inherit variables from their parent scope. The way that you're going to do that is to pass those variables using the use language construct, which is a keyword. Then it now has been pulled into the scope of that particular function. So you're injecting it in, if you will. Does that make sense? It's the same thing as how this is getting injected in. This is getting injected in when we do an apply filters, and this hook is called title and post ID are getting injected into this function, whether you're doing it this way or you're doing it this way, right here and here, it's the same. You're also injecting in the parent variables by using the keyword use. Does it make sense? Stop, do a little reading, play with it, see if it makes sense to you. Because we're going to go on, we're going to do something a little bit more now. Ready? I'm making you sick with this thing scrolling up and down. Okay. Closures were introduced in PHP version 5.3. So if you're using websites or your clients are on a website that is at least 5.3, you can use a closure. One thing you cannot do unless they're on PHP 5.4 is look at the instance of a object within the closure itself. In other words, I can't do this, and then point to whatever method is on this particular object. That came along in version 5.4. So if you're not doing that and you're not working in OOP, then you don't need to concern yourself. Everything will function as I've been showing you thus far. All right, so let's assume that you are on 5.4, or your client's on 5.4. Then you can use this. What we're going to do here is something a little bit different. I'm going to show you some other things that you can do. Alrighty, I'm going to hook into a dummy do test. It's just a hook we're going to call here in a minute. It's not within the WordPress core. There are no do test is not passing anything into the function itself. It's not injecting anything. However, the parent is passing in and injecting handle and scripts. Scripts is being passed by reference. All right, you see the ampersand sign there in front of scripts. That means it's being passed by reference. What does that mean? That means that as I move this along the way, if I change something here, or if I change something down here, it actually is changing the variable that has been called up in the parent. If you were to look in the memory and how the memory is laid out, handle is one memory location in the parent. There's another one that's being laid out in this function itself. So now I've got two. And in the listener down here, I've got three. I've got three instances of this particular variable, handle, stored in the memory stack. Scripts. Scripts, because it's being passed by reference, what's occurring is this, where you declare it up here in the parent, then I'm getting a pointer that's pointing to the memory stack where that's stored at, and I'm getting the same information, that same place. So now I've got it only one time in the memory stack, and along that it goes. Okay? It's very, how do I say it? It's a very oversimplified explanation, but it kind of gets the point across without going too deep. All right. So for those who are more advanced coders, you know, you can call me out on it, but that was just something for those who are not as skilled just as of yet or have the experience yet. All right, so what we're going to do here is I want to show you that I can call another method within the closure itself. And you can see there's a listener here, which is looking for an event. I'm passing the same variables through. They're being loaded down in here. And then what I'm going to do, take a look. I'm going to manipulate that script's array by adding the handle into the array and setting it to true. And then just to show you that it did fire, I'm just going to render out and echo out that it did fire. Let's see what happens. See, it did fire. And let's take a look at our array before I called it. The array was just foo, and it's set to false. That's it. It's the only thing that's within the associated array. Now let's go and take a look at, let's take a look at what occurred after the function was run. So as this executed, this page came up. I still have foo, and it's set to false, but I added bar. That was the handle that got passed in, and I set it to true. It manipulated the same scripts here, and you see here's bar, and I loaded that in and it fired. So it shows you can do some different things with closures. You don't just have to compartmentalize and say I'm only going to work within the closure and that's the only thing I can do with it. No, you can call things that are outside of the closure as well. In this case we're calling methods. You can call functions as well, or other hooks. Well, that can get a little convoluted, so just keep that in mind as you're laying it out. Be a little daunting for your testing. Okay, we're going to do another example here. I have a doggy class. I'm passing in a name, and I'm storing that name into a variable, into a property of this particular class. I can then do the following things for my doggy once I instantiate and have myself a doggy. I can ask him to bark. I don't know why you would do that though. Doggies like to bark too much, mostly mine. And you can tell them how many times that you want him or her to bark. I can ask them to speak. And my dog likes to talk a lot too. And you can tell him what message that he wants to say, like mama. I can ask doggy that we're going to go and take a walk. And then it will render out that doggy, his name or her name, and is walking. All right, very simplistic class. It has nothing to do with WordPress, but it's just going to give you an example. Basically what I'm going to do here is call this method, and within this method notice that I'm returning a closure. I haven't done this previously. I'm returning it and then assigning it back into a variable within the caller, which is lesson 5 is the caller method. So I'm calling doggy. Doggy has a closure which passes the name in, right? It then includes the file, which is class-dog.php. It then instantiates the dog and assigns the name, passes the name in, and returns it. All right, so now I have my closure function. I then I'm ready to bring home my doggy. So I'm going to call this particular function. I'm just going to call him Rover. Not very original, I know. So I have my doggy, and here's my Rover. Let's make him do something. We're going to make him bark 3 times. We're going to make him speak, and he's going to say, I love WordPress. And then we're going to make him walk. Let's go and see what this looks like on the screen. He barked 3 times. Mine would bark probably 30. Then he says that he loves WordPress. And look, Rover is walking. Hopefully you're with him when he's doing that. So that works. This is just showing you what you can do. There's multiple ways that you notice I called a method. That particular method then returns a closure back to me. Then I can then act upon that closure somewhere else. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Take a little time. Work with it. All right. I'm going to move on. Let's look at real world. We did with title earlier, but now I want to show you, sorry for the spinning. Here's some examples of how you can actually use this within your code. The body class is a good example. Let's take a look at, let's come back over to here. And let's open this up. In my body class, you can see I only have a couple of things on here for a body class. Great. And I'll make sure that I have that turned on, and let's go ahead and run this. Ready? Alrighty, if I take a look at my body class, see it right here? Testing-example. I injected this particular class into the callback body class. Let's go look at it. So here is a closure again that I passed into this hook. So my callback is my actual closure. I'm then, if you know or you don't know, classes are actually an array. I'm then putting my class that I want stored into this classes array and then returning the class. Now, you can see this quite often if you take a look at, if you're on Genesis, as hopefully you are. If you're not, why not? Anyway, this is very typical in Genesis. No, they're not using the closure. They're actually using a function callback. However, everything that I do, all of my custom code, uses a closure for this particular type of task. And I'm just giving you an example of how you could do the same thing. But here's one right off of this particular child theme. So it's body class, it's calling it right here, so it's calling this particular class and doing the exact same thing. So for those who don't know, the reason why you would do this, why you would use body_class hook, is for styling. You may want something that is particular for just that particular page, and you're injecting in this class, and now you're able to grab that for styling. You can also use it for some functionality that you're doing in jQuery or JavaScript. Alrighty, so that's one example. Another example. Another example, and this comes right off of the website that you're looking at right now. That's our club website, and this is how the Genesis handles the footer credits through shortcodes, and I modified that. So let's take a look. I need to turn this off first so you can see what it looks like previous to that change. And I'm going to close this out. This is what it looks like out of the box, right? Let's turn this back on. Bing! And this is what I injected in. Something a little bit different, right? Let's go look. Here's our function. We're passing in the credits. I'm then going in and assigning the shortcodes and the text that I want and sending that out on its merry way. When this gets called, when there's a do action for this particular hook, it's going to go and call my closure function that I have right here, and it's going to execute it. Another thing that could occur is I do some things with walkers for menus. Let's say you'll see a plugin coming out not too long from now from me where you can add in dash icons or font awesome icons to the front of a menu item, and I use a walker for that, basically, where you can go and select which one that you want, and it will then put that to the prefix. Well, you can set if you want prefix or suffix where that's going to be added in. So you would include the class when it's time to do the walker, and it would return the class name. That's all this is doing here. So that's another example. Take some time, read the documentation, play with it, see how you can use it. There's multiple ways that you can call and do work within PHP. This is not just WordPress, it's just PHP. And it's not even indicative to just PHP. You can do it in every language I've ever been in. So take some time to understand it, look at the documentation. If you have a question, ask it below. We're all here to help.